March 7, 1935. 11:42 p.m. Harlem, West 138th Street. The gun was already pointed when the jazz stopped. Not faded out, stopped. Like someone yanked the soul straight out of the room. Smoke hung low under the ceiling, thick and blue, crawling around the bare bulb that flickered like it was nervous. A trumpet lay abandoned on a chair. Whiskey glasses sweated onto the table, rings forming like quiet countdowns. Every man inside the back room of Small's Paradise felt it at the same time. Something was wrong. Bumpy Johnson stood near the wall, still as a shadow. Dark suit. Crisp collar. Hat tilted just enough to hide his eyes. His hand rested casually in his coat pocket, not reaching, not threatening. Waiting. Across the room, a Dutch Schultz soldier swallowed hard. The gun in his hand shook. Just a little. He didn't know this night would rewrite Harlem's history. Oh, we'll get to that. A single click echoed, the sound of a hammer being pulled back. Small. Metallic. Final. Outside, Harlem breathed like it always did, street vendors closing up, couples arguing on stoops, laughter floating up from basement bars. Nobody out there knew how close the neighborhood was to bleeding, or that bodies would start dropping within 72 hours. But the first move had already been made, and it started with a sentence. 2 days earlier, downtown Manhattan. A private room. Heavy curtains. No windows. The kind of place where men said things they'd never say in public. The table smelled like cigars and old money. Schultz sat back in his chair, fedora pushed up, eyes pale and mean. He'd just finished a glass of cognac, slow, savoring the burn. Someone mentioned Bumpy Johnson. Just the name. Schultz smiled. Then laughed. Then said it. The word. A racial slur. Sure. Casual. Like he was swatting a fly. The room went quiet. Nobody laughed this time. Because everyone in that room knew Harlem heard things. And Bumpy Johnson heard everything. This detail will matter soon, remember it? Back in Harlem, the soldier's finger tightened on the trigger. Bumpy didn't move. He could smell damp wood and cheap cologne. Hear footsteps upstairs, muffled by music that hadn't restarted yet. Feel the cold calm settle into his chest. The kind that only comes when you've already decided what you're willing to die for. Someone behind him whispered, "Boss?" Bumpy raised one finger. Silence. He stepped forward once. The floorboard creaked. The gunman flinched. And in that split second, the half-breath between violence and survival, Bumpy saw it all laid out in his head. Not just this room. Not just tonight. But the war that was coming. Because Schultz hadn't just insulted him. He'd insulted Harlem. And Harlem didn't forget. But the real twist was still ahead. To understand why that word mattered so much, why it lit a fuse instead of just bruising pride, you have to understand the numbers. Not math. Power. Harlem's numbers racket wasn't just gambling. It was rent money. Grocery money. Church donations. Funeral costs. A shadow economy that fed an entire neighborhood when banks wouldn't and cops didn't care. Bumpy Johnson protected that system. 9 men. That was it. 9 trusted soldiers. No uniforms. No headquarters. Just loyalty, routes, whispers, and patience. They moved like ghosts, barbers, shoeshiners, porters by day. By night, something else. Schultz wanted it all. He didn't want partnership. Didn't want percentages. He wanted to walk in, take over, and remind everyone who ran New York. And he believed fear would do the job. What he didn't understand was how fear works differently in Harlem. Nobody knew Bumpy already planned something darker. The soldier lowered the gun. Just an inch. That was the mistake. Bumpy leaned in close enough that the man could smell his breath. Coffee, tobacco, something colder underneath. "You tell your boss," Bumpy said quietly. He picked the wrong street. No shouting. No threats. Just a promise wrapped in calm. The soldier backed away, heart hammering loud enough to drown out the silence. He didn't know if he'd just been spared, or marked. Bumpy turned toward the door. As he walked out, jazz started again upstairs. Same tune. Same tempo. Harlem pretending nothing had happened. But Bumpy knew. The insult had already crossed a line. And blood was already scheduling itself. We'll return to this moment later. Because within 3 days, Dutch Schultz would realize something terrifying. Harlem wasn't scared of him. Harlem was waiting. Harlem didn't wake up angry. It woke up alert. Morning light spilled between brownstones like it always had, catching dust in the air, glinting off shop windows and church steps. Women swept stoops. Men folded newspapers under their arms. Kids ran messages for nickels. To anyone watching from the outside, it was just another day. But underneath the routine, something had shifted. Whispers traveled faster than cars. Dutch Schultz was moving north. And he wasn't asking. Years before that night at Small's Paradise, before the slur, before the gun clicked, Harlem already knew who Dutch Schultz was. They called him the Dutchman downtown. A Bronx bootleg king turned madman millionaire. Pale eyes, quick temper, faster trigger. He didn't negotiate, he invaded. Brooklyn learned that. The Lower East Side learned it the hard way. When Schultz wanted a racket, bodies showed up first, explanations later. He ruled with noise. Gunfire. Headlines. Public executions meant to scare neighborhoods into obedience. That tactic worked almost everywhere. Almost. Harlem was different. Because Harlem had Bumpy Johnson. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson didn't look dangerous in the way Schultz did. He looked thoughtful. Tall. Broad. Always dressed clean. He spoke slow like every word cost something. He read books most gangsters couldn't pronounce. Quoted poetry sometimes. Knew when to listen and when to vanish. But the streets knew the truth. Bumpy remembered favors. Bumpy remembered insults. And Bumpy understood something Schultz never did. Control didn't come from terror alone. It came from belonging. This detail will matter soon, remember it? The numbers racket ran through Harlem like blood through veins. Every morning, slips were passed quietly, barbershops, beauty parlors, fish markets. Pennies and dollars pooled together into hope. When someone won, Bumpy made sure they got paid. When someone lost, they still ate. That's why people protected him without being asked. That's why Schultz's men couldn't get traction. They came in loud, flashy cars, white faces, heavy accents. They leaned on shop owners, flashed guns, demanded percentages. Doors closed. Eyes turned away. Information dried up. And Schultz got angrier. The first takeover attempt was subtle. Schultz sent intermediaries, Italians with manners, Jews with briefcases. They offered protection. Claimed the numbers were unsafe without Dutch backing. Promised more money. Bumpy declined. Politely. The second attempt involved threats. A numbers runner beaten in an alley. A storefront window smashed. A warning shot fired too close to a child's feet. Bumpy still didn't respond. That silence made Schultz furious. And then came the meeting downtown. The private room. The cognac. The word. The slur wasn't shouted. It was worse. It was dismissive. Like Harlem was something to be cleaned up. The men in that room felt the air change immediately. Because once that word left Schultz's mouth, this stopped being business. And became personal. But the real reaction didn't happen downtown. It happened uptown quietly. That afternoon, Bumpy walked Lenox Avenue alone. No bodyguards. No car. People nodded to him. Some smiled. Some looked worried. He could smell fried fish drifting from an open window, hear a radio humming jazz inside a tailor shop. Life continuing. Someone passed him a folded note without breaking stride. One sentence. That was all it took. Bumpy stopped walking. Not long. Just long enough. His jaw tightened. Nobody knew this yet, but in that moment Bumpy made a decision that would cost lives. Including some of Schultz's best men. We'll return to this choice later. That night, 9 men gathered in a small apartment above a closed bakery. No lights. Just a lamp on the table. Cigarette smoke coiled upward like it was listening. Each man had history with Bumpy. Each man owed him something, money, loyalty, a life. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. Didn't pace. He simply said, he crossed a line. Nobody asked which one. One man reached for a glass. His hand trembled. Another smiled, thin, dangerous. Bumpy laid out nothing resembling a plan. Just names. Places. Times. Short sentences. And one final instruction. Don't rush. Because what Schultz didn't realize, what made this war different, was that Harlem wasn't going to explode. It was going to squeeze. Slow. Quiet. Surgical. And Dutch Schultz wouldn't understand what was happening. Not until the bodies started dropping. Somewhere downtown, Schultz laughed that same night. He thought Harlem would fold. Thought fear would travel north faster than loyalty. He poured another drink, unaware that clocks had started ticking against him. And that within 72 hours, his empire would begin bleeding in places he couldn't control. But the first strike wasn't going to look like a war. It was going to look like coincidence. And that made it far more terrifying. The first man died without knowing there was a war. That's how Bumpy wanted it. A gray morning. Damp pavement. The kind of cold that crept into your bones and stayed there. Schultz's collector stepped out of a tenement doorway near 116th Street, collar up, hat low. He had a ledger tucked under his arm and a tune in his head. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him. He felt the touch first, light, almost polite, then the sudden pressure of a cold barrel against his spine. No shouting. No struggle. Just a whisper near his ear. Wrong street. The gun went off once. Sure. Final. By the time his body hit the sidewalk, the shooter was already gone, blending into men who looked just like him. Working coats, tired faces, Harlem morning. Police called it a robbery. Schultz didn't hear about it until noon. And he didn't connect it. That was the point. Bumpy sat alone that afternoon, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup gone cold. He stared out a window that looked down on the street. Children hopped puddles. A woman argued with a butcher. Life moved forward. Inside his chest, something heavier settled. This wasn't rage. It was responsibility. Because once you start something like this, you don't get to stop halfway. This detail will matter soon, remember it? The second body dropped that night. A driver this time. Schultz's man had just finished loading crates when his car refused to start. He cursed, stepped out, popped the hood. The smell of oil and damp metal filled the air. He never saw the knife. It slid between ribs like it knew where to go. No gunshot. No witnesses. Just blood pooling under a flickering streetlight. Police chalked it up to a gang dispute. Still no pattern. Still no panic. But Schultz felt it. A tightness behind his eyes. A pressure he couldn't explain. Because two men didn't vanish from his world without reason. And deep down, somewhere he didn't like to visit, he knew. Harlem had answered him. The third hit was supposed to scare. A warning. Schultz sent two armed men uptown, loud and deliberate. They pushed into a numbers parlor, guns out, voices raised. You work for Dutch now. That was the plan. What happened instead lasted 8 seconds. Lights cut. A chair slammed into one man's knees. Another screamed as his wrist snapped. A gun fired, wild, shattering glass. Then silence. When the lights came back on, both men were alive. But broken. And the message carved into the wall behind them was simple. Go home. Nobody claimed it. Nobody bragged. But everyone talked. And for the first time, Schultz felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Bumpy met his 9 men again that night. Same room. Same lamp. Same smoke. One of them asked the question nobody else wanted to say out loud. How far are we taking this? Bumpy didn't answer right away. He could taste the bitterness of coffee, smell sweat and gun oil, hear the low hum of the city outside. He thought about the insult. About the takeover. About the faces on the street that trusted him. Then he said, far enough. Not further. Not forever. Just far enough. Nobody knew what that really meant yet. Not even Schultz. But the real twist was still ahead. Because while Harlem watched bodies fall quietly, something else was happening downtown. Schultz was losing control. He smashed a glass against the wall during a meeting. Shards skittered across the floor. His men avoided his eyes. This is Johnson, someone muttered. Schultz slammed his fist down. He's nothing, he snapped. A street philosopher with a numbers game. But his voice betrayed him. Because power doesn't like being challenged silently. It needs noise to fight back. And Schultz was about to make noise. The wrong kind. We'll return to this moment later. The fourth body fell just before dawn. This one couldn't be ignored. A trusted lieutenant. Found in his car. 2 shots. Execution style. No robbery. No confusion. Just a message written in blood. Now the papers paid attention. Now the police leaned in. Now the underworld whispered a single name. Bumpy. Schultz stared at the headline, jaw clenched, fingers white around the paper. He felt the burn of whiskey slide down his throat and do nothing. For the first time in years, Dutch Schultz realized he wasn't hunting anymore. He was being hunted. And he knew exactly who had started it. The only question left was how far Bumpy Johnson was willing to go. And whether Harlem would survive the answer. The confrontation didn't happen with gunfire. That's what everyone expected. Instead, it happened in a room so quiet you could hear men breathing. March 10, 1935. 9:18 p.m. Private social club, Midtown Manhattan. The kind of place with frosted glass doors and thick carpets that swallowed footsteps. Cigars burned slow. Ice clinked in crystal glasses. No music. No laughter. Just eyes. Dutch Schultz sat at the center of the table, jaw tight, fingers drumming once, twice, then stopping. Around him were men who usually leaned back, relaxed, confident. Tonight, nobody leaned. Because 4 bodies in 3 days had changed the temperature of New York. Schultz broke the silence first. This ends tonight, he said. Johnson comes to me or Harlem burns. A few heads nodded. One didn't. That pause, half a second too long, caught Schultz's attention. He turned. "You got something to say?" The man cleared his throat. A veteran. Someone who'd seen wars start and end. "Dutch," he said carefully, "this don't feel right." Schultz's eyes narrowed. "What don't?" "The way it's happening," the man replied. "No noise. No panic. Just disappearances." Another man spoke up, voice low. "Feels planned." Schultz slammed his palm on the table. "Everything's planned," he snapped. "That's what power is." But even as he said it, doubt crept in, metallic, bitter, impossible to swallow. Because power wasn't supposed to feel like this. "This detail will matter soon, remember it." Uptown, Bumpy stood alone in a church doorway, rain tapping against stone like impatient fingers. He didn't go inside. He just listened, to the echo, to the quiet. He'd sent word. Not to Schultz. To someone else. Someone Schultz depended on more than muscle. More than money. Someone who hated instability. We'll return to this moment later. The twist didn't come from Harlem. It came from downtown. From men Schultz assumed would always stand behind him. Because that same night, while Schultz plotted fire, his protection started to thin. A shipment delayed. A meeting canceled. A phone call unanswered. Small things. But in the underworld, small things were warnings. Schultz poured another drink. The cognac burned, sharp and useless. He could smell sweat under his collar, feel the room closing in. "Where's Benny?" he asked. Nobody answered. Because Benny had already been spoken to. 2 nights earlier, Benny had sat across from Bumpy Johnson. Neutral ground. Dim light. A single table. Benny wasn't afraid of Bumpy. He was afraid of losing everything. Bumpy didn't threaten him. Didn't raise his voice. He slid something across the table. A list. Names. Routes. Numbers. Schultz's. Then Bumpy said something that landed harder than any gunshot. "This war ends one way," he said quietly. "With Harlem still standing." Benny swallowed. "And Dutch?" he asked. Bumpy held his gaze. "Dutch already lost," he said. "He just don't know it yet." This was the real twist. Schultz thought he was fighting Harlem. But Bumpy had shifted the fight somewhere else. Inside Schultz's own circle. Back in the Midtown Club, Schultz stood abruptly. "Enough," he said. "We move tonight." Chairs scraped back. That's when the door opened. A messenger. Breathless. "Bill." He whispered something into Schultz's ear. Schultz's face changed. Not rage. Something worse. Calculation breaking down. "What?" Schultz snapped. The messenger repeated it louder this time. "They won't back it," he said. "They say the heat's too much. They say Harlem's not worth it." Silence slammed into the room. Schultz looked around. No one met his eyes. "This detail will matter forever, remember it? Because power only exists as long as people agree it does." Schultz laughed. A sharp, ugly sound. "Cowards," he said. "All of you." But his voice cracked. Just enough. He grabbed his coat, stormed toward the door. As he passed the threshold, a thought hit him, cold, undeniable. Bumpy hadn't beaten him with force. He'd beaten him with patience. And now Schultz was exposed. Outside, the city smelled like rain and gasoline. Streetlights blurred into halos. Somewhere uptown, Harlem was still breathing. Schultz lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He didn't know it yet. But this was the moment everything turned. The war was already over. Only the consequences remained. The fifth body didn't belong to a soldier. That's what made it different. It was a fixer. A man who smoothed things over. Paid off cops. Calmed angry partners. The kind of man whose name never appeared in papers because his job was to keep names out of papers. They found him in a hallway that smelled like bleach and old soup. One shot. Close. Clean. No wallet taken. No watch missing. Just a message without words. Now the underworld understood. This wasn't random. This wasn't revenge. This was containment. By the next morning, Harlem felt lighter. Not safer, lighter. Like a pressure had shifted somewhere else. Shopkeepers opened earlier. Numbers runners moved with less hurry. Conversations lasted longer. Smiles came easier. Nobody said why. They didn't have to. Fear had changed direction. This detail will matter soon, remember it? Downtown, Schultz woke with a headache that whiskey couldn't touch. He stared at the ceiling, counting cracks like they might tell him how many men he had left. The room smelled stale, smoke, sweat, regret. He reached for the phone, then stopped. Who do you call when loyalty evaporates? He finally dialed anyway. The line rang, and rang, and rang. He slammed the receiver down, chest tight, heart racing. Somewhere deep inside, a realization crept in, quiet but merciless. Bumpy hadn't just protected Harlem. He'd isolated Schultz. And isolation in their world was a death sentence. But the real humiliation was still ahead. The papers ran stories that week. Carefully worded. Vague. But unmistakable. Schultz influence waning uptown. Harlem numbers remain independent. No accusations. No names. Just implication. Schultz tore one paper in half, hands shaking. The sound ripped through the room like fabric giving way. He wanted blood. But blood only mattered if it scared people. And nobody was scared anymore. Bumpy stood at a window that night, watching rain streak down glass like tears that didn't belong to him. He hadn't slept much. Responsibility weighed heavier now than it had when the guns were firing. Victory always did. One of his men asked quietly, "Boss, what if he comes again?" Bumpy didn't turn. "He won't," he said. "How you so sure?" Bumpy finally looked back, eyes dark, steady. "Because he ain't fighting me no more," he said. "He fighting time. This detail will matter later, remember it?" Schultz tried one last move. A desperate one. He reached out beyond Harlem. Beyond New York. Looking for backing. Looking for leverage. Looking for anyone willing to help him push back. Doors closed. Excuses came easy. "He's too hot. It ain't worth it. Let it go, Dutch. Let it go." The phrase echoed in his head like a curse. Because letting go meant accepting something he'd never accepted before. That he'd been beaten. Not by force. But by restraint. Harlem held a quiet celebration. No parties. No speeches. No headlines. Just relief. Bumpy walked the streets again alone. He nodded to people. Took his time. The smell of food, the sound of music, the rhythm of life all felt earned. But victory came with a cost. Because every war leaves something behind. And Bumpy knew something else was coming. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. But someday. We'll return to this thought later. Because legends don't end when the fighting stops. They end when the story finally catches up. The war didn't end with a headline. It ended with silence. No more bodies. No more warnings. No more whispers curling through alleyways at dawn. Just absence. Dutch Schultz faded from Harlem the way a bad smell leaves a room, slowly at first, then all at once. His men stopped showing up. His collectors took different routes. His name, once spoken with tension, became something people said in the past tense. That's how Bumpy wanted it. Because real power doesn't announce victory. It lets everyone feel it. One evening, weeks later, Bumpy sat alone in a small back room, lamp low, collar loosened. The city hummed outside, trains rattling, laughter drifting up through open windows, a saxophone crying somewhere it couldn't be seen. He poured himself a drink. Didn't toast. Didn't smile. He stared into the glass, watching the light bend, thinking about the men who wouldn't be coming home. About the line he'd drawn, and the cost of holding it. This detail matters now, remember it? Because legends aren't built on violence alone. They're built on choice. Word traveled as it always does. Not in papers. In rooms. In the way conversations stopped when Bumpy entered. In the way other bosses listened longer. In the way deals shifted before they were ever written down. Harlem had held. And everyone noticed. Somewhere downtown, Dutch Schultz sat with the same drink in his hand, but it tasted different now. Sour. Heavy. Useless. He stared at walls that suddenly felt closer, rooms that felt smaller. He still had money. Still had muscle. But the city no longer leaned his way. And he understood, finally, what the insult had cost him. One word. 72 hours. An empire cracked. Years later, people would argue about what really happened. About who fired first. About who betrayed whom. About whether it was race, money, or pride that started it. But Harlem knew the truth. It wasn't the gunshots. It was the patience. Bumpy Johnson didn't win by being louder. He won by being unmovable. There's a saying the old-timers passed down low and slow. Dutch came with fear. Bumpy came with memory. And memory lasts longer. Bumpy finished his drink and stood. He straightened his coat, adjusted his hat, and stepped back into the night. The air smelled clean after rain. The streetlights glowed steady. Harlem lived. He didn't look back. Because he didn't need to. The city already remembered his name. Anyone can start a war. Only a few know how to end one. If this story hit you, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what moment changed everything for you. And if you think this was the end of Bumpy Johnson's battles, wait until you hear what happened when the Italian mafia decided Harlem's independence had gone too far, and Bumpy came face to face with Lucky Luciano. That meeting? Almost ended New York.